Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Anomaly Arbitration. I say welcome back not only because we get a new AA, but we're back in a sense of Hoyo innovating more and more ways to make AA as miserable as possible. And I'm not even going to say it's because they're greedy. There is genuinely unhinged shilling, don't get me wrong, but they brought some things in this AA that genuinely nobody asked for and nobody benefits from. Most people I've interacted with think this is the worst Anomaly Arbitration so far, and I'm inclined to believe that it is a logical and valid opinion based on my own experiences. This video will serve as both a guide and review, including an overview of the fight mechanics and the best characters that you might want to use in these fights. Anyway, intro splash. I would usually go the easiest to the hardest in terms of the night stages, but honestly it depends on your account, which are pushovers and which are completely impossible. So let's start with night 1. The debuffs here are completely new. Unwavering is basically the only debuff tailor-made to counter break, and quite possibly the most obnoxious counter to a single archetype that has ever existed. Depowered is at least a temporary debuff. Meanwhile with this, even if Dahlia can still do super break damage outside of break, getting cut into half is just not viable. The other debuff is Scales, which is basically an innate ramp-up time in which you need to hit the enemy a lot of times, otherwise you're biting a 40% damage reduction. This should be final damage by the way, and not just a normal damage reduction debuff. This debuff specifically cripples a lot of characters that do damage in few hits, like hypercarry teams, but wait, that's only half of the story. In terms of enemies, the first wave you have this new Lighthouse Mech enemy, and the Decaying Shadow from 1.x. On the second wave, you get another Lighthouse Mech and the 1.x Elite Cocolia. Very simple enemies that I don't think need to be explained, except for the new one. The star of the show here is the Lighthouse boss, because wow, this boss is actually just annoying. On its first turn, it will summon a bunch of smaller robots that are pretty fast, and then enter a state where it tallies 12 on the enemy side, and reduces all of the enemy's damage taken. If you remember Hulei's mechanic, this is the exact same mechanic. If you attack the enemy, the tally on the enemy side is lowered, and your side gets higher. If the enemy attacks you, the reverse happens. And this means if any enemy attacks, by the way, just like Hulei. So if the little robots attack, or if the Decaying Shadow attacks, that's +1 for the enemies. Anyway, if the Lighthouse Mech takes a turn before the player can get to up to 12 stacks, the Lighthouse does an extremely strong attack that action delays you. If you can get 12 hits uninterrupted, it will instead apply a strong damage increase debuff on the entire enemy field as a reward, and it won't do the big attack next turn. If you compare the HP to the previous AA Night 1, Cocolia has almost the same amount of HP as Argenti, and less threatening in terms of their attack pattern. But the Lighthouse enemy is a pretty thick enemy, and considering the stage debuff and the innate attack count mechanic, this is a lot higher HP in practice that will force you out of your comfort zone. So with the basics out of the way, how do you actually beat this boss? I'm going to be completely straight with you. This fight is prime evidence that Sustainless should be studied by every endgame player. The main and practically only problem with this stage is high attack frequency in very controlled, short periods of time. Because of the Lighthouse mechanic with how fast these minions are, you are sort of forced into a very small window where you have to do a lot of attacks. Failure to do so results in not just a possible death, but a massive action value delay. This delay is so punishing that even if you can survive it, it probably isn't gonna result in a 3-star. The damage reduction from the Scales debuff, the lost time from the delay, and the damage reduction from the boss all combined means there are very few teams that can deal with this with a sustain. The damage would just be either too low, and sustains aren't known for high attack frequency. Even DHPT struggles a bit to keep up here. Meanwhile, instead of PT, if you bring a more offensive attack frequency enabler like Tribi or Mortenax Blade or Roberto, it is miles better since the enemy does not hit hard at all if you can do the gimmick, and you don't get gutted by an action value delay, which means you just have more time to clear the stage. This is a scenario where Sustainless is genuinely the only way a roster might be able to full star this. Obviously, characters like Ashveil get away with a Hyacine, but something like Saber Mesh becomes a lot trickier without Eidolons. This is a scenario like Murata Graphia King stage where adding a sustain makes a team go from 0 cycling to 3 cycling. There's really no middle ground for the gold medal because being forced to interact with boss mechanics is much more punishing than trying to skip it. This is a scenario where it is not a coincidence at all that Roberto, the current banner character, is a character that bridges the gap between a sustain and sustainless run so well that she's one of the only ones that can clear this with a sustain comfortably. Yeah, this is the meta now. I don't think I like it either. Because of this, if you're being stretched thin of supports to do a sustainless run with, this fight suddenly becomes a lot more annoying. You paradoxically die easier with a sustain, or most likely just don't meet damage at all because the delay is too punishing. Speaking of which, I guess I should just talk about the best teams for this fight. These are the best units for this fight from the testing and the amount of footage that I saw. This is just a list of units that scale really well with sustainless, with the exception of Break because Break gets completely obliterated here. Finon I can see somehow working, but that's definitely an E2 angle since Cocolia is also physical res. DOT can work, but it needs to be supplemented by Blade or Welt, otherwise there's just not enough ways to deal with the attack count. Honestly, anything that you usually use sustainless consistently will probably work here just fine. This is ironically the least restrictive because it only bans one archetype, and that one archetype is useful elsewhere, so it's fine. Does this speak to the quality of this AA that this is the most flexible? It kinda does. But again, if your account simply does not have enough pieces for sustainless or a specific support that can bridge the gap from sustainless, Roberto, then you're gonna have a very wonderful tour of the mind of an HSR balancing team's Hall of Mirrors. Anyway, terrible fight. These robots doubling down on attack frequency at least makes them straightforward, but it doesn't feel fun ramming your head through a brick wall. It's fun when you have the pieces like follow-up attack and utterly miserable without it. Next is Night 2. All I have to say is what the hell happened to Starrail. I didn't know about this at all, but little Ika decided to give the enemy a Tevat fried egg and turn them into the Wild Hunt. I'm talking about this thing called Corruption Level 2, which came completely out of nowhere. The live stream didn't even mention this, and there wasn't any leaks about this. That's funny. So what does this do? It's the Wild Hunt gimmick from Genshin Impact where if you kill an enemy, they don't straight up just die, but rather they revive with a portion of their HP with a smaller health bar that you have to deal with again. This doesn't apply to all enemies, only a select few enemies, and 2 HP bar enemies like sparxie only revive their last HP bar. At least for now. This is only Corruption Level 2, imagine if this goes to Level 5. So basically this stage has some enemies that effectively have more HP than what the raw HP value would suggest. I'm not exactly sure how much it is, but it seems to be around 20% more HP. That's fun. This specifically screws over units with pulse damage timings like Saber or Gilgamesh, and well, they struggle a lot more with something else in this fight. We'll talk about it later, because it gets a lot worse. Aside from the new corruption mechanic, the debuff is Flow Break. This is the least of the fight's problems, to be honest, since mechanically, Flow Break doesn't even do anything because it just stacks too slow in this type of fight. But anyway, the enemies are the Joy Ascendant and the Rocking Rebel. Because of how the Joy Ascendant works, Flow Break won't even get a chance to stack that high. The Duck is a problem though since it just hits really hard, and running Sustainless is really good here. The Bird has the Corruption mechanic, which means you need to double tap them to clear the first wave. Wave 2 is Sparxie, who also has HP Corruption. The HP of Sparxie is higher than Mecha Pom Pom from Night 2 by 1 million per phase, which is more than 10% HP inflation. Fun fact, this is now the same HP that Sparxie had when she was a King stage. Isn't that fun? Yeah, this is not a good experience whatsoever. So, how do you beat this fight? Honestly, my tips are going to be more about team building because this fight is just weird. It's very weird. The corruption mechanic in practice is not actually that punishing. It specifically only messes up teams that have enough damage to clear at the last minute. Usually once the DPS gets their next turn to double tap, the enemy will die pretty quickly. So for example, if you are only able to clear at 1 AV left for the second cycle, corruption would be really cringe, but if you overkill by 1 turn, this kinda doesn't matter. Thankfully the corruption isn't on the Joy Ascendants or the Sparxie minions, otherwise I would be throwing hands. The most intricate team building exercise here comes from Sparxie and the subfield mechanic. Characters that you would think are good for this aren't very smooth to play with. You would assume that Ashblade does the best here because it has flow break, but Ashblade doesn't really work as well since Ashveil moves his prey mark to the subfield, making them pretty rigid to play around with. I would imagine Ashveil suddenly losing his follow-up attack and energy because he's all alone would be quite frustrating. And Mortenax Blade doesn't apply his debuffs on the subfield, so it's just very weird to play follow-up attack here despite the flow break mechanic. Archers should have been able to destroy this if it wasn't for the fact that joint attacks don't trigger if the other character is in a different field. This is why Saber Mesh doesn't show up that much here either. Because of the Rocking Rebels damage and the higher HP, making it through the first wave with Sustainless is reserved for very few teams. Firefly can definitely do Sustainless here, as I did myself, but it needed an E2 Dahlia. Honestly, she's one of the smoothest characters to play here as long as you have E2 on either Dahlia or Firefly. It's like they forgot to mention she's rerunning or something. Elation is obviously shield here too because the subfield mechanic is very favorable towards AHA instant damages. Flow break isn't exactly that favorable to Elation, especially compared to follow-up attack, but because they match the Sparxie mechanic much better, they actually should be getting better scores than Ashblade. Much like Night 1, because of how high the HP is, there are very few teams that can deal with this without ditching a sustain, and because of the subfield mechanic, there aren't a lot of meta DPSs that can handle it without extremely high investment or just feeling very scuffed. Because the execution of this stage is rather low, and the build difference is going to hit hard, and I can't do general advice this way, my tips are kinda just advice of what characters to use, because otherwise the subfield mechanic chops up a lot of recent meta DPSs for some reason. So here's the best matchups. Anybody outside of this list either has one of their mechanics chopped up, or very unlikely to meet damage. Someone like Aglaia technically is a good enough matchup, but she's quite aged, and Roberto can't really save everybody in this meta. Aside from that, this fight is pretty simple. Just note how the subfield interacts with your roster, and this fight might be a lot more painful or really easy for you compared to other people. The last is Night 3, featuring no new enemies actually. There's a new debuff though, and it's probably the most obnoxious debuff HSR has ever seen. Joint Forces. That says a lot, by the way, because it's on the same Anomaly Arbitration with Unwavering. But anyway, Joint Forces reduces damage taken by 60%, and for each additional target on field, it's reduced by 20%. Take note of this specific wording, because it's not as straightforward of a shield debuff as you think it is. This is by far the biggest shield you'll ever get from a debuff though. This should be final damage, by the way, not just vulnerability, so it really is that bad. The first wave is actually, there's two sets of these enemies. There's two War Armor bosses and there's two Blaze Out of Spaces. Very basic enemies, we know how they work from this point forward. And the second wave is our favorite Flame Reaver. Surprisingly, the HP here, if you only look at Reaver, is actually deflated. Previously, Reaver back in 4.3 had 7 million. Meanwhile, now he only just has 6 million. But because of the Wave 1 Elite's HP, it kinda cancels itself out. And well, because of the debuff not being taunting, Reaver has a constant AV lock that you are forced to interact with, which makes meeting damage a lot harder. And now it's time to show why this boss is a lot harder than it is on paper. This fight is being utterly carried by this obnoxious debuff. Let's have an exercise. Do you want to count how many remembrance units there are in HSR? Do you want to count how many work outside of Mono Rem? Do you want to count how many are premium? Yeah, there's not a lot of options here. The HP of this fight is actually very low. The problem is that the HP kinda just increases by 60% if you're missing a Memo Sprite character. And it goes down to 40% if you have RMC, then 20% if you're using Hyacine. But I do see complaints that Mono Rem isn't doing as much as people expected, and there's a very simple reason for that I don't know, is this intended from the devs? I'm not even sure at this point. I want you to read again and take note of the intricacies of this debuff. It says specifically for every on-field target past 4. This means that Cyrene, whose Memo Sprite is out of bounds, does not count and does not reduce this damage reduction. This means that Evernight will constantly switch between having a 20% damage reduction because her Memo Sprite explodes, which sabotages Hyacine and everyone else on the team's damage, and then you have Castris who does the same thing. So playing the good old-fashioned mono Rem with Cyrene actually has a noticeable enough performance gap compared to Roberto, because Roberto's Memo Sprite is permanently on field. Of course, you can play around this by making sure all Memo Sprites are up when Castris does her ultimate, but it does feel quite clunky even with Castris' overcap mechanic from Cyrene's buff. Evernight main DPS suffers a lot less, since only her damage should matter, and her damage only matters when her Memo Sprite is still alive. But Castris having to rely on Evernight in the same team is a bit trickier to work around. Mono Rem is still heavily shielded, but it's just not as free as you think it is. Without Mono Rem in this night though, you aren't actually out of options, because there are units who can brute force through 60% more HP inflation, because they are just not balanced. And yeah, this is Archer Sustainless. In my experience, he actually performed better than Iwan Aglaya with Roberto and Hyacine, simply because at the same cost investment, he's just, I guess, 40% better without the debuff, I guess. The debuff is pretty nasty and it is scary, but it's not impossible to vault over it. It definitely requires Sustainless for Mono Rem teams though, even with RMC Archer in mind. And obviously, even replacing RMC with base Robin at E2, you will feel that RMC is better because of this debuff. It's actually insane. And once again, Flame Reaver is a feast or famine boss, meaning it is very easy if you meet the threshold, but if you can't meet it, it is significantly harder. Because of that, aside from the debuff, Reaver is just a really cut and dry boss. Do enough damage and you win. Bring your best characters that can brute force at 40% HP inflation increase, and Sustainless with them with RMC or Roberto. Or you just give up and use Mono Rem, because good game design is very difficult. As for teams, what teams? Only Mono Rem is eating. The rest are just using RMC or Roberto or Hyacine since they are so flexible just to turn off this padded HP debuff. A notable anti-synergy is fine on because even if you have Roberto on the field, he kicks them out and he has to face tank 60% damage reduction. What an amazing experience this fight is. This fight is pretty shallow, so I can only give you shallow advice. I'm sorry guys, this is literally all that I can say about this Night 3. So now that we're done with the Knights, let's move on to the King stage. And boy, if you thought the Knight stages were bad, somehow it got worse. King in check is Iron Tomb at 12 to 15 million HP for phase, shared between 3 targets. The debuff is Hemobore, say bye to your Sustainless runs, and Scales to shield follow-up, I guess. The buffs are Annihilation Shield 1, a generic ult and skill damage buff. There's also some nifty energy here for Welt, which is quite nice, and a Mono Rem buff, I guess. The basic mechanic of this boss is to focus on the flanks, because if you don't kill them, they will do nasty effects on their turn like action lock or drain energy. Once you've taken them down, they'll stay on field but take a lot more damage. And after a while, they wake up and get their HP back. Pretty simple boss. You also have the Cyrene attack as your R skill. You use this to damage the flanks easier while also keeping the Amphorian Hatred in control. Once the Amphorian Hatred bar goes into certain percentages, the party gets debuffed with less max HP and less max skill points, so be careful. You can't let this bar max out, otherwise it's an instant loss. I'm not kidding, it's not even a boss nuke, you just lose. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Just kill the flanks fast, and then you win. This fight is a lot harder than it sounds though, because these flanks are tanky. They take a while for even Ashveil to go through, and he's like the best single target option not named Archer. For some reason, the flanks are so ridiculously thick by themselves, but the Scales debuff doubles them down and makes it so much worse. This fight is really toxic, for both Zero Cyclers and casuals. For Zero Cyclers, they have to deal with Scales, which just ruins a lot of Sustainless runs because of Hemobore, and the last phase having an unavoidable nuke gated behind the flank HP doesn't really help either. And for more casual players, they have to deal with the fight not being able to be completed because you didn't do enough damage fast enough and the enemy just kills you because of this. It's like the Lygus King stage from back then, where higher cycles meant your minimum sustained power would just get bigger and bigger. I've seen discussions that most people think this is one of the worst, if not the worst King stages, and I'm inclined to agree. I think it's hard to defeat Lygus because it was such a different time, but Iron Tomb is so frustrating to play against. It has less RNG than Murata last time, and at least it has that going for it, but these base mechanics and Hemobore are so damn annoying that I can fully accept that, yeah, this is probably the worst king stage. And again, this is one of those cases where if you run a sustain, you survive, but getting a 3-star might be a stretch, and if you can sustainless, it becomes a 0 cycle. Yeah, this ain't it, boss. It combines some of the worst HSR has to offer. The mechanic is do big damage, and if you don't do big damage, you die. What is this, man? I'm not allowed to even take a survivor award because I'll die if I don't do big damage. These are like 2 different goals of a fight. Why is nobody calling this out? Wow, it's been a while since I can actually talk about this. Are we going to have another discussion about the worst Anomaly Arbitration so far? Yeah, we are. I don't think anything could really beat that one AA Knight blunt rotation that, at the very least with this phase, and with the help of Roberto, a free character like Gilgamesh can clear Kokolia, same with outdated limiteds like Anoxa and Dahlia, though it's a bit sustainless reliant. At the very least, there was one stage you can throw good enough units and win with sustainless compared to other phases where every knight was equally terrible. It's really close to the bottom though. This AA is disgusting. Who the hell asked for this quirky, spooky veracity debuff as an excuse for HP inflation? I swear, the devs are a bunch of cornballs, bro. Just spike the HP by 30% and be done with it. Don't tie it into the lore that your balancing is dog shit. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me do a screen wipe so I can actually move to this topic and make a transition. What is this? Who is this for? Doesn't this make Silverwolf look more dog shit? Why did they add this? And who is being shilled by this? It only serves to screw over large chunk rotations like Gilgamesh and nothing else. Is this a federal psyop to redirect anger to the game design to the veracity? I feel like I'm losing my mind here. Granted, it's not that important in practice, at least with just level 2, but it's so unnecessary when these guys just added joint force debuffs, and it does almost the same thing as corruption level 2. It's even more insane that they added this on goddamn Calyxes, the farming stages. Why would you add this on farming stages? Is it a conspiracy to make people use their quick farm feature? Why? I swear to God, the problem is also that you know they'll try to put this on MOC. Just like how Star Wars incorporates Knight level HP as an extra stage for one of their sides. Yeah, we see you, bruh. I'm waiting for that corruption level 3 on Hule and MOC because for some reason, this is now something they thought was important enough to add. Did someone find an exploit where having 2 HP bars generated 20% more profit? Do we blame the Joy Ascendants for this discovery? Anyway, I'm gonna get an aneurysm. This rant is over. Anomaly Arbitration is back to being the worst game mode I've ever seen in my life. I can't say I didn't expect it. I knew all along that it was gonna get worse, but this corruption level thing is the most unnecessary addition this game has ever done. I really wonder if 1.x only players are listening to this video and are having a heart attack like a Victorian child. Enjoy the 5 weeks of this monstrosity presented by honkaistarrail, the best gacha game I've ever played. Thank you all for watching. I hope this rant was worth watching anyway. I'll see y'all. I'm actually gonna play a real fighting game, and goodbye.